For those of you maybe were not in sessions yesterday, I'm Mark Meyer with the Park Service, landscape architect, and I work on the visual resource program. So I'm going to talk about here just real briefly today before we spend some time on the BLM contrast rating system. That one's a much more mature and well-rounded and grounded system. It's been around for a while. We're in the process of developing this method for the Park Service. So it's a little bit of a work in progress, but give you a little bit of an overview on what we're doing. So talk a little bit about the, just real briefly on how this fits into our overall program and its relationship then to our inventory process that we talked a little bit about yesterday. And then talk about the little bit different components that we use for an impact analysis process that they're still related to the inventory, but they're slightly different. And then just a real quick overview of the actual method that we have in mind to be able to do this. So the VIA process, the impact assessment piece, fits into kind of the support aspect of our program. We have an inventory process that we work with parks and understand the baseline information, baseline values of the views in parks. We work with them to try to get those values into long-term planning so that they kind of live long-term in some of those other resource management documents, and then help the parks also come up with methods to manage those resources and come up with best practices and understand how they can manage their own visual resources inside the parks better as well. So by way of background, we developed our inventory process just basically in 2014, and it's been, had a couple little tweaks since, over the years, but it's been pretty consistent. And we've tried to provide with that process a method for the parks to do, an inventory consistently. Parks in the past have come up with methods to understand their landscapes and assess the impacts of projects, but it was kind of a one-off, kind of a, do what you can for this immediate need. And there was no real method to, from one park to another on how they did that. And of course, as with any federal agency, this is really going to be built to underpin, NEPA in the long run. That's one of its primary purposes. So what we did initially, we had a pilot that we tested a couple of years ago on the James River. I'm sure many people are very familiar with the transmission line. So we came up with an initial process, an initial idea of how we might want to do this. That included a team assessment that we took out with a big group into the field. We did some visibility aspects of that, similar to what you may have just seen in John's session, using the visibility scale that Argonne had developed for transmission lines. So it was kind of a pre-test of a particular, an idea that we were trying to come up with. And there were some good things that came out of it. There were some things that we found that didn't really work that well. But one of the things that really did stand out, that really seemed to work good, was the idea that we've got a group of different people that look at the landscapes differently. And so that team assessment piece really came out as a really important aspect of what we're doing. As far as its relationship to our inventory, we have an aspect of scenic quality and view importance. Those are our two halves of our inventory. And we don't use direct use of ratings in the VIA. Okay, so we don't take the scenic quality rating that we come up with on our inventory and then say, okay, well, this decreases inventory by 10 points, therefore, now it's scenic quality C instead of B. And we don't do that with the view importance ratings either, but we use the aspects that underpin those ratings as part of the impact assessment process. So as we look at the actual parts of our impact assessment method. The first part we're going to, is what we call scoping. In some of them, it's an establishment, kind of laying the groundwork. And the first part of that is understanding what the project looks like, what its features are, what its forms, lines, colors, and textures are, what are its visual characteristics that we're trying to fit into the landscape. And then understanding just in general where that landscape is, whether it's in kind of those Piedmont regions, whether it's valleys, just in a general sense what the context is, developed areas, undeveloped, natural, and give a sense of that regional context, and then trying to understand where we're going to be able to see it from. From a park perspective, we have, most of the time we have dedicated viewpoints. So by running a view shed analysis with the project, in the landscape, we can discover then hopefully where those observation points are in a park that we'll be able to see a particular project. So we don't have to do an impact assessment from areas that don't have a view of a particular project. So then the next piece that we do is the affected environment component. And this kind of directly relates to NEPA. We go into a much more detailed analysis and description of the existing landscape, and particularly as it's seen from each viewpoint, because that's going to change, from the perspective of the project and the perspective of the landscape. We want to understand about the particular viewers that are at location. Some, locations might attract, a wide range of viewers and have a heavy visitor use, where some may be much lower use, but maybe they're photographers who are very concerned about the landscape. So we want to kind of separate that out and understand who the viewers are at a particular location. And then something that's a little bit unique in what we do is that we have come to this idea that the actual unit can be affected as well. So as the NPS as an entity, a lot of what we do is tell stories. And so interpretation is a really big part of what the Park Service does. And things that can affect the landscape, in many cases, could affect those stories. And so we really wanted to step back and understand how the unit itself and the interpretation and the meaning of that landscape to the park might be affected by a potential change. When we get to the analysis piece, we do some kind of comparable things to a number of the systems, the methods that are out there. We have a compatibility with some of the existing character things, and this is where we start to bring in a number of the inventory components, because we have an existing landscape character integrity as part of that inventory. So when we're looking at the compatibility of that, are materials compatible? Are some of the landscape context pieces, or is it compatible? If this is an agricultural landscape, does this kind of feature fit in versus a natural landscape, or if it's a suburban kind of a setting? Contrast, form, line, color, texture. That's going to be a big part of what Alicia's going to talk about. That's a really, really well understood and robust process and stuff to understand how things are going to stand out. And when we understand how they're going to stand out, then that can maybe lead to ways of, better integrating a project into the landscape. And then a piece of what we do in the inventory is visual harmony. So then we want to understand how something might contrast or not fit in with the spatial compositions and the patterns that are out in the landscape. If it's going to be very disruptive, if it's out of scale, if it's out of place, and those kinds of things. So those are the kind of the analysis components that we are looking at, including at this point. And as you can see in the bottom there, this entire process and any really good evaluation is really dependent on having good simulations. When we did the Virginia kind of tested the methodology, we had an existing project in place and we knew what it was before. We could look at it after, we could use some visibility ratings, but we had to kind of take your cap off a little bit and kind of imagine, what the level of impact would be and stuff with that out, with it out, without the project and then adding it. And so there were some challenges there in actually doing an impact assessment method for an existing project, because really a VIA is going to be done in advance of a project. And so having those simulations and being able to really judge those changes in the landscape from those simulations is going to be pretty critical. When we get to the analysis piece, then we're going to be looking at the actual impacts to the viewers and the unit, as I kind of described. And this is pretty important for what we do in the Park Service. Is our NEPA folks their current guidance is that we want to stay away from the idea that we have thresholds, that we have a high impact, a moderate impact, or a low impact. There are no bright lines in their thought process. There are no bright lines in this process to say that you crossed over by doing this, you crossed over from a moderate to a high impact. What is that line? What's that meaning? So their whole guidance in this process is to describe what's going to happen to the landscape, what's going to happen to those viewers in a descriptive kind of an aspect. And we don't know exactly how that's going to play out yet. But one thing that we're not including in this method at this point is any kind of a scoring or rating system that says this has a high impact, this has a low impact. That's just not the way that we're going to be approaching this. So as we get to an actual process, it's pretty stepwise in those components that I was mentioning, is that we're going to establish that baseline information and understand where it is and where we can see it from, and then do a pretty comprehensive inventory of that existing landscape. We want to understand information about the viewers and the unit itself and its interpretive stories, and that's all sets up kind of that baseline information. And then there's an impact, kind of methodology that we will develop and flesh out as we go forward in a step-by-step method to say that, okay, with simulations in hand, here's what we expect, from an impact assessment, result and stuff. And as I noted, our outcome of at the end of this is not going to be that this project has an overall impact of X. There's going to be impacts to the viewers and there's going to be impacts to the unit that may be totally different and stuff, because the impacts to the actual unit for many of the viewpoints may or may not be as extensive as it is to the viewers and stuff, because an interpretive story, a landscape may not be as disrupted as much as, the photography for a particular location for a set of viewers and stuff like that. So, there's a number of things to be worked out here. We've got to, again, the Park Service is, as we like to say, is just kind of getting into the game. We're well behind in this, and there's a lot of really good information out there from the existing systems and Forest Service, BLM, FHWA. There's a lot of good things for us to base our methods on. So we've got a good foundation, and this is kind of our next step in that process in developing this impact assessment method to kind of complement and kind of complete our program elements and go along with that inventory component. And I think that is it. If there's a couple of questions, I guess we've probably got a little bit of time, but otherwise I think we're just going to flow right into Alicia's presentation. So while we're switching here, let me stop sharing. So, all right.
If anybody has any questions, you can put them in the chat box.
Okay, so I'm
Ready?
stopped, I think. So I think Leisha can take the screen.
So Alicia from BLM will be up next. Thank you, Mark. That was wonderful.